All right, we are continuing to work our way through right now in Genesis as we are kind of taking an overview of the entire Bible is the purpose of what we're doing. I am not staying right on top of making sure that we go as quickly as I might go, say, if I were sitting down and studying with someone, because I'm enjoying the study with you. And we've talked about some things, gone more in depth, and right now we are in the middle of talking about Abraham. However, before we do, let's make sure that we are at least keeping in our heads certain things that are important to remember. Like, where does all of this begin? If we had a timeline of the Bible, where does it really begin? It's not a trick question. I mean, it's literally begin as one of the first words of the Bible, right? Creation, right? In the beginning, it begins at creation. All right, I might need to, this thing's, I'm making it to where it's not writing very well. It's got plenty of ink, but I guess I just smash it against the board too hard when I write. So, we start with creation, and then God creates everything. It's perfect, it's very good. What are the four things that we talked about that you find in the creation, at least the second creation account that you find? Okay, the tree of life, a great river. Who's there? God and man are all there. And then you get to Revelation chapter 22. And what do we find in that picture? Tree of life, great river. All right, God and man, they're there together again. So those are the pictures that we have. We have the beginning and the end, but what's the problem? Thank you, sir.
I don't know if
Yeah, we'll see. I'll use this one until it really starts to annoy me that it's all smudgy, and then I'll switch over. What's the problem? Why is that surprising that the beginning and the ending are the same? All right, sin entered into the world. Where does sin enter into the world? All right, Genesis chapter 3. This is, by the way, one of the key passages, 5 key passages of the Old Testament. And Genesis 3, what happens in Genesis 3? All right, this is often referred to, the word's actually not there, but we often refer to it as the fall. As Cliff said, sin enters, and so you have a fall, which is why it then becomes surprising that in the end, it's almost as if it didn't happen. In Genesis 3, you have various curses that are placed, very specifically, the serpent and the ground are cursed, but then tangentially as well, not just the serpent, the woman, the man, and ultimately, beyond just the promise of death, what is the ultimate ending for that story? All right, separation. They are removed from the garden, and there's a cherubim who's placed there to make sure they don't get back into the garden. Why? Okay. All right, very good. Sin separates from God. That is where God resides, and His holiness cannot be there with the sin. But very specifically, in the text in Genesis chapter 3, Kelly, what were you going to say?
They can't have access to the tree of life.
All right. Remember when he kicked them off so that, he said, lest they reach out and they eat from the tree of life and live forever, ... unfinished statement that you have there, he then removed them. Why? Why doesn't he want them to eat from the tree of life? It's just this one of those punishments again. It's like, you've been bad, you're not allowed to eat this. Okay, hold on a second, Jeff. Let's hold on.
Blessing because being that we are human, we would, if we partake of the tree of life, we would be eternal.
Yeah.
And we would have no end, and so therefore it would be a curse in some respect for the human, but we want that relationship with God, and he says, no, you're not going to be having access.
All right, very good. It's actually for their benefit. This is God's grace in action, because they are in a state that they're separated from God. They're in a fallen state, and do they want to live forever in that position? No. You would want to live forever in the fixed state, as the case might be. Are we having Zoom issues again tonight? Oh, we're good. All right. That's good to hear. All right, very good. So that's Genesis chapter 3. And then from Genesis 3, we followed through the flood narrative. We followed through the Babel narrative. And we ended up at the end of that. Remember Genesis 1 through 11? What would we call that for the Bible, really? That would be the prologue. That bit of information that gives you all the background that you need to understand the story. And then you move into the story. Where do we move into the story of the Bible itself? All right, with Abraham. What chapter? All right, Genesis chapter 12. All right, so we come to Genesis chapter 12, which, by the way, is what? Genesis 12 is? All right, I was just saying peace. No, yeah, it's the second key passage of the Old Testament, right? Genesis chapter 12. What happens in Genesis 12? Okay, promises are given to Abraham. We talked about those last week. We said, at least the way that I enumerated them, because I put a couple of them, bunched them together so we'd have a nice, good, fun biblical number. How many did I say there were? 7. And how many of those were promises that Abraham would not have seen fulfilled in his lifetime? All right, 3 of them. What were those? All right, nation, land for that nation, so that ultimately, through that nation, all the families of the earth would be blessed, or in the reiteration, chapter 22, in his seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. So these are the 3 promises, nation, land, and seed, that now we should expect to see fulfilled as we are making our way through the Old Testament story. This is ultimately kind of serves as a little bit of an outline of the promises that are going to be fulfilled, the nation, finally the land, until such a time as the seed is going to be given. That's as far as we made it last week. And this week, we're still going to be in the Abraham portion of the story. I want to go to Genesis chapter 15, just a few pages over. We started in on this passage last week. If you will recall, Abraham, what's he doing in Genesis chapter 15? Say that again. Okay, he's asking God for an heir, and you put that very politely, because really, what is he saying to God? Well, I don't know if he's saying you lied so much as saying, where is he? He says, I know. By the way, how does he know that he's supposed to have an heir for his household?
He's not dead.
What's that, John?
He's not dead.
Okay. But how does he know that one's going to come before he dies?
He's going to have a son before he dies, and he's not dead yet, so he knows God. And so he's asking, where is he? It's time is wasting away here.
Okay, but how does he know he's going to have a son before he dies? That wasn't promised. What's that?
The Lord said that Sarah would bear an heir to his throne.
You do eventually definitely see that. But right here,
Nation
where's
and
the
seed.
promise of a son here?
Nation and seed, it's implied.
All right. The promise of a son is implied in these promises, right? It's implicitly there. It's not directly stated, but how can his descendants become a nation and be given a land so that through them everybody in the world could be blessed? Unless he has a child. And so he steps out, he goes, God, it's been a couple years, and this guy, Eliezer, he's the one that's going to be the heir, who's going to take over everything. It's beating around the bush type of a thing. Very, very passive-aggressive way to come out and talk to God, saying, where's my son that you promised me? And how does God respond? Yeah.
He says that man's not going to be your heir.
Okay. All right. He says that man's not going to be your heir. You want to follow up? Keep on. Wait for the mic here, but go ahead.
Look to the heaven and count the stars if you can count them. He said, so shall your descendants be. But
Yeah.
he said in verse 4, this man will not be your heir, but one will come forth from your own body, and
Yes.
he will be your heir.
All right. Very good. So he answers, yeah, this guy is not going to be here. In other words, he's like, trust me. We're good. I've got you. This man will not be your heir. You don't have anything to worry about. In fact, let's go outside, count the stars. And we talked about this last week. Are we supposed to take from this some kind of scientific concept and say, wow, it's amazing how many stars there are. That's how many heirs he's going to have? No. That misses the point, right? This isn't about, wow, when you look through the Hubble telescope, there are even more stars than we knew about. No, all he's saying, it's just one of those object lessons, just like, hey, can you count those stars? And Abraham looked up, could he count those stars? No, he didn't live in Salem, Oregon. He lived in a time and a place where you couldn't count the stars that are in the heavens. And God says, so shall your descendants be. And then Abraham, what? All right, Abraham believed God. Or Abram, right? But it says that Abram believed God. He believed the Lord, and it was what? All right, it was credited to him as righteousness. All right, let's talk about this. This is where we left off. And I said, I want you to think about this idea of credit. Does anybody else have anything besides credited here? Accounted, okay. What else you got? All right, reckoned. Some people might have it was counted instead of accounted. Reckoned, credited. Anybody else have anything different? Those are kind of the main ones. All right, well, let's talk about this for just a second. When you see these words, credited, accounted, reckoned, what kind of words are these? These are accounting words. These are financial terms, right? And so when he says that Abraham believed God and it was credited, accounted, reckoned, we're in a financial discussion at this point. So wait for the mic to get up here. But go ahead.
Actually, I was just saying, or making this symbol like it's a tick mark, like on a ledger.
Okay. Yeah. With especially like reckoning, something being reconciled, as the case would be. So yeah, absolutely. What I think we're getting at here, if we see these as financial terms, here's at least the best way for me to visualize what we're looking at. Abraham has an account. And we're just going to call it his righteousness account. And when Abraham's born, what's his righteousness account like? When he's born, it's as full as it can be, isn't it? Right? When he's born, at that point, has he done anything by which he has become unrighteous? No. And so it's perfectly full until what happens? Right, until sin occurs, there's some kind of problem that takes place, and what happens at sin? That becomes bankrupt, right? So, you have a problem here if you're Abram, because his righteousness account is bankrupt, just as everyone else's. However, I think what we have in this is another bank account that's under discussion. What account is that? All right, his faith account. All right, now I'm going to keep you all from talking for right now, and we're going to let the adults catch up to you, okay? Because y'all are nailing it, but their brains are still working. They're a little bit slower. You guys, your brains just, they work faster. So, you have also a faith account that is under discussion. Abram has a faith account and a righteousness account. So, when Abraham believes God, what does that mean for his faith account? All right. His faith account is pretty full at this point in time. So what does God then do? What does it say? Abraham believed God, and it was what? Credited as righteousness. Of course I took my wallet out of my pocket. How many of you guys have one of these things? Anybody? And I don't mean a debit card that's tied to your bank, your bank account, like a credit card, right? When you think of credit, that's the first thing that comes to my mind is a credit card. What's the purpose of a credit card? Kelly?
The financial institution that you got the card from is paying money for you because you're good for it.
Yeah, pretty much. That's kind of how it works, right? This is a Chase card right here. So if I pull this out and I hand this to the cashier and say I would like to pay for this with my Chase with this, has anybody ever had your card taken and say, well, of course, if your name wasn't Mr. Huntley, of course not, but they might say, well, Mr. Huntley, I'm sorry, I can't do this. This belongs to Chase, not you. Right? Is it my money? No, I'm not paying with my money. I'm paying with Chase's money. But how does the cashier see it? How do they recognize it? Do they see it as Chase's money or my money? They see it as my money, right? Dale, did you have something you were going to say?
Yeah, just a smart remark.
Okay.
One of our kids was really young. He said, if you have one of those, you don't need money.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and that's the idea of crediting where it's not my money, it's Chase's money, right? Let's just say me and Chase, but they see it as if it is my money. They recognize it as if. They use it. In everybody's viewpoint, that is my money, even though it's not. Now, of course, I have to pay Chase back, and if I don't do it right, with interest and all kinds of other stuff. But that's the idea of credit, is where an account that is not yours is viewed as yours. It's treated as yours. Let's carry that discussion to Abraham here. He has a faith account a righteousness account that's what? It's bankrupt. It's depleted. But what about his faith account? It's full. So what does God do? Well, it's not really a transfer so much as it is I'm going to look at your faith account as your righteousness account. I mean, if you want to think of it as a transfer, that's fine, if that helps you here. But what God does is he looks at the faith in order to determine the righteous. It is credited to him. The faith is credited to the righteousness account. As far as God is concerned, is Abraham righteous before him? Absolutely. Is he righteous before him because of his own righteousness? No, he's righteous before him because of his what? Because of his faith. And God credits that account over to him. He looks at his faith as if it is righteousness. Does that make sense? How it is that we can view Genesis chapter 15, that Abraham believed God, and therefore he is considered to be righteous before God. Not because of his own righteousness, but it's because of his faith. All right, questions on that? Is everybody good with this picture? Now, what I'm going to do, and we're not going to do this all the time, but I think it's a little important right now, is to break from where we are in the story, because Paul actually really deals with this very particular scenario in Romans chapter 4. So I want to go up and I want to look at how it is that Paul talks about this in Romans 4. We're not always going to do this. It's not like every single time that there's a connection from the old to the new, we're going to break the flow and look there. But I think it is really cool to take a look at what we can gain in our understanding. So Romans chapter 4, and in a few months, it's towards the end of the year at some point. Don't ask me which quarter, because I won't be able to tell you off the top of my head. We're going to start going through Paul's letter to the Romans. So I don't want to dig too deeply into this right now, but y'all probably at least are familiar with the flow up to chapter 4. You know, he gives his thesis statement for Romans in verses 16 and 17 of chapter 1. Not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to all who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, just as it is written, the righteous one shall live by faith, quoting Habakkuk. That's the thesis statement for his argumentation, his polemic throughout Romans. It's all about that. Particularly, it's open to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And then he lays down in chapter 1 that the Gentiles are worthy of the condemnation that they have because, and I appreciated Kelly this morning, spent a good deal of time taking us through the various things in Romans chapter 1 in his prayer that show that the Gentiles are worthy of their condemnation. But then he goes into chapter 2 and says, and all you Jews who are sitting in the back yelling, amen, Paul, go get them. Yeah, well, you guys are just as guilty, and you stand just as condemned. In fact, chapter 3, there are none righteous, not one. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And the righteousness of God has been revealed or made manifest, has been shown to us apart from the law of Moses. So it's not the law of Moses that shows us how to be righteous. It's actually Jesus. And a lot of this is going to be Paul saying, now, I know you Jews, you're going to have a hard time with this. Stay with me. Follow my line of reasoning here. Let's start at the very beginning of Judaism. And that begins with whom? Abraham, right? And so in chapter 4, what then will we say about Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh? Was he made righteous or considered to be righteous because he did the works of the law of Moses? Is that possible for him to have been? No, because he predates the law of Moses by a good 600, 700 years or something like that, right? So there's no way that he was justified by the works of the law of Moses. And then you have David. Why does he quote David in chapter 4? Do you think? Blessed are the ones whose lawless acts are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Why is that one important? Kelly, come on up. Mr. Elliott here.
Well, it looks like you're pointing towards verse 8 about blessed is the man whose sin the Lord will not take into account.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so why is it important that David is the one saying that?
Because he recognizes this transaction.
Okay, yeah. What do we know about David? David, pretty good guy? Generally speaking? Never made any problems? Never did anything wrong? Never violated maybe the last 5 of the 10 commandments all in one go, right? Did he ever do anything that was worthy of condemnation and death and execution according to the law of Moses? Yeah. Was he condemned and executed? No. Instead, he was what? A man after God's own heart. But what does he say right here? Blessed is the one who murders, commits adultery, steals, bears false witness about it, covets neighbor's wife. Blessed is the one who does all that stuff. And what? And he's forgiven. Where does that forgiveness come from? Does it come from the law? Does it come from the fact that he does certain things of the law of Moses? No. It's apart from that. The law of Moses does nothing to justify him. And then he goes back and he says, all right, now I know you Jews, you might say, well, did Abram have to do anything that you find in the law? He did, right? What did he have to do, he and his household? All right, I heard someone say it over here, circumcision. It was Jan, right? Yeah, circumcision. They were circumcised. And so the Jews would say, all right, Paul, I know you're playing a little lawyer trick right here, and you're trying to make it look like he had nothing to do. He was circumcised, though. Even though the law wasn't given, he was still bound to justification by the law because he did the things of the law before the law came. So he was circumcised. Wouldn't that be kind of a feather in their cap and demonstrate maybe they've got a point? Maybe he did receive his justification when he was circumcised and entered into that covenantal situation with God in that way. Is that valid? Until you read the next section. Yeah. Thank you, Sean. Anybody know what chapter Abram was circumcised, he and his household? Genesis. Did someone say 17? I thought I heard someone say 17. Over here. Did you say 17? All right, excellent. You got to be louder though, so I can hear you. So yeah, very good. Yeah, Genesis chapter 17. She's like, I think it's 17. I'm gonna say it just loud enough, but not so loud in case it's not right. Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah, Genesis chapter 17. When was Abram declared righteous? Before that, what chapter are we looking at? Genesis chapter 15. So even before circumcision, can you see Paul's argument, his flow of thought right here? And he's like, yeah, you might be able to make this argument, but it's not valid because he was declared righteous by God. He was justified by God in chapter 15 before he ever had anything to do with circumcision, before he did anything of the law. And then here we get to the payoff for us and what Paul is saying here as he's led them through this. Verse 16, this is why the promise is not by the law of Moses. This promise comes to us by faith, so that it may be according to grace, to guarantee it to all descendants, not just those who are of the law, that is, the law of Moses, but those who are of Abraham's faith. For he is the father of us all. As is written, I've made you the father of many nations. He's our father in God's sight, in whom Abraham believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls things into existence that do not exist. He believed, hoping against hope, so that he became the father of many nations. According to what had been spoken, so will your descendants be. He did not weaken in faith when he considered his own body to be already dead, since it was about 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb. He did not waver in unbelief at God's promise, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God because he was fully convinced that what God had promised he was also able to do. Therefore, it was credited to him for righteousness. All right. Can you see Paul here is arguing now about what was going on in Abraham's mind in Genesis chapter 15 when God comes to him and says, count the stars if you can, so shall your descendants be. What was it that's the problem for Abraham at this point in time? For having a child, what's the problem? What'd you say, Cliff? All right, he's pretty old at this point in time. He's like, at one point in time, I could have fathered a child, but those days are beyond me as he sees it. Now, we know he won't have much of a problem. There's going to be a few more children that are going to come, but that's the way that he at least sees it. But even more than that, he considered what? His wife. What about her? Okay, hold that word for just a second. But what about her as far as having children? All right, she's beyond childbearing years, right? She's well beyond. This is something that really can't happen. We have gone well beyond the point that she would be able to have a child. And yet there's a word that he uses a couple times. Kelly, what was that word? You said it earlier, and I said, hold on, not yet.
Her womb was dead.
Okay, there you go.
Her womb was dead.
All right, her womb was dead. What about Abraham's body?
As good as dead.
As good as dead. Don't mistake this word, dead. This is about death right here in Romans chapter 4. This is about death. He said, my body is basically dead. Sarah's body, her womb, is dead. There is nothing but death. But what has God promised? He's promised to make life from death. That's what it is that Abraham believed. I'll put it down here. Life from death. This is the promise. Yeah, Jan? Okay. Hold on for the mic here real quick. There you go.
It makes me think of Lazarus and waiting, and he's dead. He can't
Yeah.
come in that same God waiting for that time to make sure they understand.
Yeah. Yeah, and so with Lazarus and in John and you see the 4 days, very particularly 4 days, so that when he said open the tomb, and they were like, yeah, not a good idea. He's beyond the ability to be raised by the dead at this point. And Jesus says, no, he's not. He can create life from death. And that's exactly what's under discussion right here. This is what Abraham believed. In other words, Abraham's faith that was reckoned as righteousness was a faith that God would do what? Make life from death. What does that then have to do with us? Verse 23, it was credited to him, was not written for Abraham alone, but for us. Who, it says, it will be credited to us who believe what? We believe the resurrection. Or, what's the resurrection? What's that faith? That God did what? Kathy?
That he made life from death.
That God made life from death. That's the story of the resurrection. That's the power. In other words, are we so different from Abraham? When it comes right down to it, we might say, well, I've never been promised a child and have this, and I'm not 100 years old still waiting for that child, and that really has no bearing on me whatsoever. And Paul says, au contraire, it does. It has a huge bearing on you because it's not about faith in the specific. It's about faith in the idea that God makes life from death. And is that not exactly what God did through the resurrection of Jesus? Therefore, he goes on to say, he was delivered for our trespasses, and he was raised for our justification. That what would happen for us? Well, let me say this. According to Romans chapters 1 through 3, what's our righteousness account like? It's bankrupt, isn't it? But what about those who put their faith in the fact that God, through Jesus, made life from death? And we have the same faith as Abraham. What will happen for us when we have that faith account? He's going to credit that as righteousness. You see Paul's point? It's the exact same thing. Our faith is the exact same faith as Abraham's faith. And the result is the exact same result. That God will take our faith account, our faith in Jesus, in the resurrection, in the one who was delivered for our sins, but he was raised, the power of the resurrection, for our justification. By the way, I really didn't talk. What does justification mean? I know I sprung this one on you. That's one of those biblical buzzwords types of things. What's justification?
To make right.
Okay.
To straighten out.
Very, very close to, I think, what it is. I mean, it may very well just simply be that, but I think it's a nuance to it. It takes something. Well, let me say, has anybody here ever done something that you knew was wrong, and then you tried to figure out a way to make it okay? What did you do? You justified your actions, right? Yeah, Kelly?
Are you searching for moving it from one column to the other? Justified?
Yes. Yeah. Well, what I'm searching for is, it's not necessarily making it right, it's declaring it right. It's a judge who says, what you did was wrong, and there's nothing that can change that, but I still declare you righteous. What you did is still wrong. That hasn't changed. but I'm going to declare you righteous and let you out of this courtroom free without any problems. That is justifying. You know, it doesn't change the wrong. It doesn't take away what we've done. What it does is God takes this, here's at least how he justifies. He takes the faith account and then he declares it the righteousness account. He credits it over. It's not our righteousness account. It's not anything that we've done. It's our faith, but he looks at it as if we are righteous based on our faith that we have in the death, the burial, and the resurrection of Jesus, that God took what was dead and made life. John?
I was going to ask you a question, but you answered it already.
Okay.
The fact is that when we have this faith, it activates God's capabilities of giving us righteousness, this state of being righteous. It's something that we cannot do for ourselves, like you said. We don't do it by our own works, by our own efforts. I was going to add that and see if it fits in what, it probably messed up a Jew's mind, but it activates God's ability to apply his grace to us also, like he did to Abraham.
Say that last bit again.
It allowed God to activate his grace towards Abraham and towards us also. Not only does we get justification and righteousness applied to us in God's eyes and make it right in him, but it allows him to forgive us anything that we have done wrong. And that's what Paul's talking about, is it not?
Yeah, that's the idea of justification. I mean, that's exactly what we're talking about.
So the word grace is involved in all this study, but that would be kind of a foreign to the Jews, wouldn't it?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think they would have understood this. See, to the Jewish mind, and now we're encroaching on what we're going to be talking about on, what's today? It's today Sunday or Wednesday? It's Sunday, right? Sunday. So Wednesday. Well, we're encroaching right now, and I actually was glad about this. It helped set some of the discussion up on what we're going to be talking about on Wednesday when we start getting into Galatians, in which really Galatians and then Romans, they're separate, they're different in their approach, but under them, they have the same idea. That is Jewish teachers who have a misunderstanding of how we're justified. To the Jewish mind, they would have understood justification. They would have understood that they're not righteous. The Jews, so far as what we can understand, they did not believe in a meritorious salvation. That's the way they're often depicted, that they could do so many works in order to save themselves. And no, they were just as much based on faith as Christianity is based on faith for salvation. It was what they put their faith in that was the issue. They put their faith in the works of the law of Moses to justify them so that God's grace would be activated through their performing the works of the law. And so, yeah, they would have understood justification, they would have understood grace, they would have understood all the same ideas. They were just putting their faith in the wrong place. And that's Paul's whole point here when he says, or in Galatians, when he very specifically says, you cannot be justified. So therefore we are justified by faith and not by the works of the law. You know, when he says that, that's what he means, is you're putting your faith in the wrong thing to justify you. We put our faith in the same faith as Abraham, that Jesus died and was raised from the dead, that God made life out of death. That is the faith that really, truly does justify you, according to Romans chapter 4 leading into chapter 5. So, yeah, John, they would have understood it. He is taking ideas and redirecting them, is what he's trying to do. Does that make sense? So, this whole conversation, hopefully, as we really dig into Galatians, for those of you who are going to be part of that discussion, hopefully will make a whole lot more sense as we go through. All right. We've spouted a whole bunch of stuff here. How y'all feeling about this from Romans 4? Anybody have any other questions on what we've been looking at? Does it help us then to understand Genesis chapter 15? Because Paul is filling in some blanks for us, isn't he? Because in Genesis 15, does it really say that he was thinking about death? No. Or the barrenness, the deadness of his wife's womb? No. That's Paul saying, you know what? This is what makes sense when you compare it to Jesus and where we are and what our faith is. And so he's doing some reading between the lines for us, and I think it is giving us an accurate picture then. All right. Questions or comments on Genesis 15 or Romans 4 and how they tie together? Don't worry. Like I said, in sermon last week or whenever it was, you'll have forgotten all about this by the time we get to Romans anyway. And then we can have the discussion all brand new, right? All right. Very good. We've got just a couple more minutes, and with that, I want to introduce the next story. And this one I usually don't actually really spend much time with, but like I said, I'm having fun right now, so we're doing the things that I find fun to talk about. In Genesis chapter 22, this is sometimes referred to as the Akedah, or the binding, is how it is described. This is the place in Genesis chapter 22, God tested Abraham. And he said to him, Abraham, here I am. And then verse 2, he said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, go to the land of Moriah, offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. How many of y'all are familiar with the story? For the most part? All right. So, let's see if we can cover this in just a couple minutes, because the main point is that I want to get across is not necessarily part of the story. We'll cover the story at some point. We'll have a sermon or a class or something which will go into a lot more detail, because there's a lot of cool stuff here, like how Moriah is basically the place, the mountain range where Jerusalem is, the 3 days, where basically in his mind, his son is dead, we'll go 3 days, come back. You have the offering, the son, the only son, right? The son, the unique son, the one you love, and offer him as a burnt offering. You have a willing sacrifice of the son, because he's old enough to carry the wood, and he's cognitive enough to understand that there's a sacrifice going on, but there is no sacrifice. So he's old enough to get it. He seems to be willing, trusting of his father, even trusting enough that when it goes to put him on the altar, he doesn't flee. I mean, keep in mind, if Abraham was pretty old before he was born, he hasn't gotten any younger, right? He probably could have gotten away if he wasn't a willing sacrifice. The fact that the Lord provided, don't mistake the fact that the sacrifice that is sacrificed, where did his head end up? The ram was caught in the what? In the thickets, the thorns, right? So he had thorns around his head. You guys see all the pictures here, right? I'm just naming stuff from Genesis 22, and how many of y'all are in the gospel right now? Right? This is clear. I mean, this is one of those, how can you miss it? Which, by the way, no New Testament writer, save perhaps the Hebrews author, makes a connection to Genesis chapter 22. I find that fascinating because it is so clear. But the Hebrews author is the one that I want to go to. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 11. And, we don't need to do a deep dive into Hebrews 11. We've spent our time, with Hebrews 11. So, I don't want to do that. But by verse 17, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. He received the promises, yet he was offering his one and only son, the one to whom it had been said, your offspring will be traced through Isaac. He considered, well, how many of y'all have heard something on Genesis 22, and it began with, say, a father teaching and say, man, how hard would this be? I can't imagine if I was told to take Sean, my oldest son, and take him to Moriah. I mean, that would be really expensive just to begin with. But even then, to take him there and to kill him, oh, the anguish and everything else. Y'all heard that type of thing? Yeah. I don't think Abraham was there. I personally, I don't think Abraham had a problem with this at all. There may have been in the back of his mind, something going on, but when it comes right down to it, I don't think this was a moment in which there was just anguish going through Abraham because of the next phrase. What does it say? Verse 19, he considered God what? He considered, okay. I'm looking at a different translation, so someone read that for me. Verse 19. Mike, what do you got?
It says, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense.
All right. What did he believe about God? Yeah, just go ahead and say it real loud. All right, yeah. This is the faith that he had. Because God had told him, this is your son. This is the son that's going to form a nation. This is the son who's going to have descendants that will have this land. This is the son through whom the seed is going to come. And if God says to him, take him on a mountain and kill him, then what does Abraham assume that must take place? If I kill him, he's still going to live because that's what God has promised. If I kill him, God's going to find a way for life to be there again. He will be resurrected. I don't think this was an anguish-filling thing at all for Abram. I think he's just going out saying, I don't understand it. I don't get it. But it doesn't matter if I kill him because God will raise him up again anyway. That is the exact same faith demonstrated in Genesis chapter 15. It's the exact same faith that he talks about in Romans 4, which, by the way, gives us one of the best definitions of faith, that he believed that what God had promised, he's also able to perform. Being fully convinced what God had promised, he's also able to perform. That's one of the best definitions of faith. It's trust that God has promised it, he's going to do it, and even if he tells me to kill this kid, I can kill him knowing full well that, yeah, he's still going to live. It would be a whole lot different if I were to take any of my boys out there to kill them because I don't have this promise. God's never told me that one of my kids is going to bring about such a change, and yeah, I don't have confidence that God's going to bring him back to the life, but that's the difference between me and Abraham. Abraham did have that promise. And we see a big difference between chapter 12, when we had some trust issues. Remember we talked about that? And now when he says, all right, whatever you say, I'll do it. By the way, there are two places in the New Testament where it talks about Abraham being justified. Two different authors speak of it. One of them we just talked about, right? Paul talks about it from Genesis chapter 15. Who's the other one? Richard took us through this book not long ago. No. Nice try. No. James. Right? Richard did teach James, right? You guys aren't gaslighting me right now, right? No, sir. That is right. Okay. Yeah. James is the other one. Does he mention Genesis 15? Where does he mention? Genesis chapter 22. These are the 2 points that are demonstrated that Abraham was justified in these two places. They're intricately, Genesis 15, Genesis 22, intricately tied together. All right, we are actually a couple minutes over where I wanted. I need to bring this to a conclusion and turn this over to Richard. Any other comments or anything? Thank you. Very good. All right.